Coming up next here on the Metal Command podcast, Nevermore sets to make a comeback in 2025. I review Gravedigger's new album, Bone Collector, coming out January 17th of 2025. I talk about why bands have to fight harder to get their albums promoted properly. And of course, Udo Dirkschneider has decided to re-record the album Balls to the Wall by Accept with a new twist to it. All of that coming up next here on the Metal Command podcast.
You are listening to the Metal Command podcast.
Greetings and Happy New Year here on January 1st, 2025. Tony here from the Metal Command podcast. Again, I always do appreciate any support that you all give this show. So if you like what you see in here on this podcast here on the YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe button, hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video. And if you are following me on any other form of social media, by all means, give me a like and a follow there. With that being said, I have a lot to discuss. Really excited today on January 1st. It's a brand new year. Been on vacation for the last probably week and a half now, but I'm really excited to be back, and there's a lot of great stuff to talk about today. So obviously we have Nevermore making a comeback. Of course, you have that whole scenario unfolding with Van Williams and Jeff Loomis basically kind of putting up a little teaser that something is going to happen with the band in 2025. Udo Dirkschneider is doing something pretty unique with the fact that he is re-recording the album Balls to the Wall, the famous album by Accept, probably their most successful album here. And he has a list of guest musicians, which is pretty impressive, actually. So I'm going to talk about that. The new Gravedigger album coming out January 17, 2025, Bone Collector. I'm going to touch on that. And, of course, I'm going to also talk about why bands, even more so today, need to fight and fight hard and push back a lot to get the album they're putting out promoted properly. I'm going to go into that as well. So let's start off, though, really quick with Nevermore. So we saw this trailer put up. Jeff Loomis posted it. I believe it was on Instagram or one of his social media accounts. There's a video talking about, it's basically a video says Nevermore 2025. So it sounds like it's very obvious he is going to be resurrecting the band with Van Williams. Obviously, this has caused a big stir. And honestly, this came out of left field. I don't think anybody was expecting this to happen. I was actually quite surprised when I saw this. I'm like, Nevermore. But expect the unexpected in the metal scene, right? So let's talk about that for a little bit. So essentially, they're talking about bringing the band back. I'm going to guess they have a singer picked out, but they have not announced it. Probably probably a bass player picked out. You don't see anything. We don't know for sure. We just know that Van Williams and Jeff Loomis want to bring the band back. At least that's what it looks like. And I'm going to start with your reactions because I put this up on the social media pages. I was like, what do you all think of this? Do you think that, what do you think of this band coming back? Now, obviously, Warrell Dane is not with us anymore. He has been gone for quite a long time now, as he tragically and sadly passed away years ago now. So what do people think? Before I get into my opinion, I'm going to go into the reactions I ended up getting. First of all, let me just say I was shocked that the reactions, at least in my circle, on my social media outlets, were mostly positive. I didn't really see a lot of, you had some pushback, like no, you're always going to have the people that are going to say no Warrell Dane, nor no Nevermore, right? Yet some people saying that they didn't really like Warrell's voice and it'd be interesting to hear that music with a different singer. I sort of disagree with that because I think his voice fit that music perfectly. And that was part of their sound. But Jeff Loomis, obviously one of, if not the main songwriter in the band, bringing the band back. And I think that's what it focused on. A lot of people were excited for this. And then I thought about my own opinion of it. Like, what do I think? And a lot of people just want to hear Jeff Loomis write and record music again. Now, Nevermore hasn't put an album out in a long time. The Obsidian Conspiracy came out quite a long time ago. And honestly, for me, it was probably the band's second weakest album. I mean, it wasn't bad, but it definitely was a big step down from the Godless Endeavor that came out before that. And Nevermore, folks, they made a pretty good mark on the scene. I mean, they were really, people would always talk about the Warrell Dane, Jeff Loomis combination, and people just loving that band when they were around. I have always had a very positive experience with anybody from that band anytime I had encountered them. Again, early on, when they were touring for Dreaming Neon Black, for example, I got to meet them several times. They came through Cleveland a few times that year, actually. I think it was like 2 or 3 times. But I got to be honest, I'm really excited for this, right? Like, I'm really excited for this. And I think it goes into why there isn't as much pushback with them reforming the band, because I think the main thing people really loved, and this is no disrespect to Warrell Dane, I think what people loved first and foremost about the band was Jeff Loomis, was his guitar playing. That is one of the things that people have missed. I mean, he was in Arch Enemy, really wasn't writing anything, and to me, it was almost like they were wasting his talent by not allowing him to write any music for that band. Now, I don't know the whole intricacies of that. I don't know why that was. Maybe Jeff felt, hey, I don't have anything I could contribute to this band. That happens. But I am glad. I'm actually really excited that Nevermore is most likely going to make a comeback. Now, they will obviously end up getting another singer. I'm cool with that. You know, I saw Sanctuary with Joseph Michael. I thought he did a phenomenal job, after Warrell Dane had passed away. But generally speaking, I'm pretty excited for this. And I think a lot of people are excited for this. I think there's less, normally when a singer, like when a band comes back and they don't have the original singer, there's usually a lot of pushback. There's usually a lot of people like, oh, the band's not going to be the same, yada, yada, yada. But I think in this case, because Jeff Loomis, his guitar playing is so loved by so many people, and the fact he was a big factor in how that band sounded, being basically, from what I know, and I could be wrong, being basically the main songwriter in the band, I think that is why we don't see as much pushback against this. So I think that you don't have a lot of naysayers. I mean, I've seen some bad comments on social media, but when you compare it to other bands coming back without certain members, the pushback just isn't there quite as much, nowhere close to as much. Like, say, for example, the last Warlord album, for example, no Bill Samus, lots of pushback initially. And then the album came out, and then all the emails came out about Bill wanting the band to push forward without him, and it shut a lot of people up. This situation is different because of the fact that Jeff Loomis his playing is loved by so many metalheads out there, and because that guitar playing and songwriting is such a big part of Nevermore's sound, that is why you don't really see too much pushback on this happening. So I'm looking forward to it. I mean, the other thing is, too, when you think about it, when I go back and I went back and listened to a lot of the Nevermore material, listened to a lot of those albums, like Dead Heart and a Dead World, Dreaming Neon Black, The Godless Endeavor. I start listening to these albums, and I keep thinking to myself, man, I'd love to see those songs played live again. So that is the other aspect in this. This band has been gone. I mean, I think Obsidian Conspiracy came out like 14, 15 years ago now. I mean, it's been a long time since Nevermore has done any gigs, and since a lot of these songs have been played. So I think a lot of metal fans that got into Nevermore either after the band broke up or liked the band back in the day and saw that band play, now they're going to be able to hopefully experience these songs live once again. And I'm excited to see that. I hope this happens. I hope this is a true thing, which I believe it will be. I think I have some mutual friends of Jeff Loomis, people that know him, and he's a guy that's who's probably going to make sure this is done correctly, and he is going to find the right people. And I really think this band, my gut feeling tells me this is nothing but positive. And I think this is going to turn out really well. So I'm excited, folks. I want to know what you think. What do you think in the comments? Let me know. What do you think about Nevermore making a comeback? Obviously with a different singer. I mean, for me, Nevermore is mostly Jeff Loomis. Warrell Dane was a big part of the sound. The only thing you're going to lose out on, really, Warrell Dane had some interesting lyrical concepts. His vocals were obviously a big part of that sound. So that will be lost. But I'm interested to see who the singer is going to actually be, because there haven't really been any announcements of that. Just a teaser saying the band is going to come back in 2025. So anyway, I want to know your comments. What do you all think? I think it's a great thing. I think it's a positive thing. I am glad that the band is looking to make a comeback. It's been a long time, and I think Jeff Loomis getting back into the fold and writing and recording that style of music, because Nevermore was a pretty unique sounding band and out there in the metal scene, one of the more unique bands I've ever heard, actually. I am excited for that happening. So let's get into another positive to start off the year. Gravedigger has a new album coming out January 17th, 2025. Now, I ended off 2024 on a high note. I ended up having two really cool interviews. I had Andy Darris from Halloween. He came on at the beginning of December. And then I had Chris Boltendahl from Gravedigger come on the show to promote the upcoming album Bone Collector. You know, I got to be honest, Chris is a really, really cool dude. I have the utmost respect for him. The band is celebrating 45 years. 45 years. Now, I know Judas Priest celebrated 50 years. But Gravedigger has been around for 45 years. You know, when I think of Gravedigger, I think of Noise Records. There are 4 power metal bands that came off of Noise Records that were huge for me, and still, to this day, are 4 bands that I absolutely love. Obviously, Gravedigger is one of them. They were one of the earlier signings on Noise Records. Halloween, Rage, and Running Wild. All 4 of those bands. We actually, in that interview, which I'll link in the show notes here on YouTube, that I'll put the full interview up. We talk about those bands. We talk about Noise Records. We go into a lot of history behind Gravedigger, their time in Noise Records, how they got their start, all the the concept albums that they've done over the years, and just we go through a history of the band. And I was able to actually see the band tour the United States opening for Blind Guardian, and it was I'll tell you what, Chris is a phenomenal frontman. He really knows how to work a crowd. The show was fantastic. And Gravedigger's been one of those bands I've consistently loved for close to 30 years now. So let's talk about the album Bone Collector. Now, for those of you that follow Gravedigger and know the band really well, you know the band always does a concept record pretty much almost every single time. You know, they put an album out that's telling a story. You have, albums like Tunes of War or Knights of the Cross, or, just all of these albums are mostly concept records. Fields of Blood, all these albums are mainly all concept albums. Well, this time, the big difference between this album, there's actually some very big differences with their new album Bone Collector compared to the rest of their catalog. First of all, it's not a concept album, meaning that you don't have all these songs aren't part of one story. Like, you're not going through all 10 tracks, which is basically each track telling part of a story. Now, for example, if you listen to Knights of the Cross, they're telling the story of the Crusades. Tunes of War was about the Scottish rebellions. Excalibur was about King Arthur. Rheingold was a concept album. So most of their albums have been concept records. Bone Collector is not. Now, there are some very gruesome themes to a lot of these songs, but they are not linked as far as like a concept record would be concerned. Like, they aren't all telling part of one story. And the interesting part about this band doing this is that, they haven't really put an album out with this style since probably The Reaper, which was basically their comeback album. And it gives me vibes of that record, maybe some of the 80s stuff. Now, I'm not a fan of the 80s stuff as far as like the production and the sound quality and stuff on those albums, but this album is a little more straightforward, a little less progressive, and it is not a concept album, but I think the album is phenomenal. It's one of my top 5 Gravedigger albums if I had to pick one. The songs are great, and the album itself was a lot different. In fact, Chris Boltondahl came on the show, and he gave a brief overview of the album. Check out this interview clip from our interview back towards the end of December. Check it out. New album called Bone Collector, which I think is really, really good, and it's great to have you back, sir.
Oh, thank you very much.
All right, so let's talk about this record. So I've had some time to listen to it over the last 2 or 3 days, and it's just, there's something different about this album compared to the last album. I'd like to think that getting a new guitar player may have something to do with that, but overall, I mean, the album's just straight ahead heavy, in your face, and in my opinion, one of the heaviest albums you've ever done. And let's talk about this record, man. I mean, it's been a while since you had a record out, like an actual, Gravedigger album. Let's talk about Bone Collector.
Yeah, when Toby Kersting joined the band, something changed, As usual, if a new guitar player, a new member will join the band, something happened. And with Toby Kersting, he's a really old school heavy metal fan, He loves Running Wild, he loves Halloween, he loves Gravedigger, and he's an awesome guitar player. But on the other side, he's an awesome fan. He has a huge collection of records at home, CDs, vinyls, and as you know, I did my solo project with him together with Chris Bolton at Steelhammer.
Mm-hmm.
And when Axel left the band, it was for me it was a logical thing that Toby will join the band. So with Toby, we are able to capture some spirit from the 80s back to the band, And that was very important for me, because when we started in the 80s, it was all what we did with Gravedigger was very simple, If you listen to a Heavy Metal Breakdown or Witch Hunter, it's a simple song structure, simple lyrics. Everything was really simple. And over the years, we are more connected to this concept CDs, which are fine, definitely. Tunes of War, Excalibur, or also the previous one, Symbol of Eternity, all that good. But to bring back this old spirit, that was totally important for me. And I think that we are nearly reached this goal to let the people feel what's Gravedigger, the essential of Gravedigger,
And that is Chris giving a brief overview of the album, basically talking about the fact that the record is different. Now, one of the highlights of the album for me is their new guitar player, Tobias Kersting. He played on Chris Boltondahl's Steelhammer. That was a solo album that came out a little while back. I think Tobias plays some great riffs. And I was like, man, and every time, it's kind of funny. I talk about guys in bands who pick really great singers for their band or pick great band members over the years. I think Chris has always done that. And one of the biggest positions in this band, he's done a phenomenal job as far as bringing into the band are guitar players. And Tobias Kirsting is definitely no exception to that. Check out this clip. He talks about Tobias and talks about why he picked him for Gravedigger. Check it out. You know, you mentioned Tobias coming into the band, and I've noticed, you know, I remember when Manny came into the band. I remember when Axel came into the band, and you could always get a feel of the new person. Like, you could feel a change. Not saying the change was bad, but you could feel a change. And when those guys came in, I remember when Manny came in, the first album he played on, which was basically a self-titled album. That album blew me out of the water. And when you look for these guys and when you ask these guys to join the band, what was it about them that you knew they would add something to this band and really kind of improve things for you?
I think that when Manny joined the band, it was a little bit more of this progressive stuff. He was playing with Rage,
Yeah.
and the big difference was that he more or less had to learn this old school stuff, you know. And I always wanted to do an album like the old Black Sabbath or the Osbourne stuff, and that was more or less a target when Manny joined the band. That we did this one with the greatest self-titled album. When Axel joined the band, we thought about doing a second part of Tunes of War, and we created this one with The Clans Will Rise Again. And when Tobias now joined the band, we said, oh, wow, we are fucking old school again. So he can play all this stuff, and he loves it because that you can listen to this album that Tobias is still loving the stuff he's playing, you know. And it needed a couple of time to find out the right sounds of the bass, of the drums, and also of the guitars, to find the signature sound from Gravedigger again, you know. I think that is something we left a bit in the last 10 years, this signature sound we created, and that was a main target. And that everybody in the band said, okay, let's go back to this sound, not sound like a heavy metal breakdown album, but the spirit of this first album should be in the new one. And we worked a lot on that, and it came naturally that it sounds like the older albums, but with a timeless sound, and it rocked.
Okay, and that's Chris talking about the newest guitar player in Gravedigger, Tobias Kirsting. Again, I think Tobias brought new energy into the band. I think that's part of the reason this album is as good as it is the fact he brought a new guy in, brand new energy, different style of guitar playing, and man, the album rips. To me, starting off the year with this record, I give it a 10 out of 10. It is that good. It is definitely an album of the year candidate. And I'm really excited for everybody to be able to hear this album, because I'm going to be honest with you, the singles that are out right now do not do this band justice. And not just the band, but they don't do the album justice. Sorry. And I think that departing away from the concept album thing and going back to the roots of what this band began doing, you know, it's kind of that song "Back to the Roots" off, that they re-recorded not long ago. The fact they've gone back to the roots for this, to basically kind of just write more straight ahead songs. There isn't as much progressive stuff. You don't hear as much. You don't hear this concept album type thing. You don't have all these interludes and things like that. I think it's great. The album rips. I mean, you really couldn't go wrong with an album sounding like this. And it's great that they kind of went back and did something like this. Because again, the last time I heard songs written the way that these songs are written was the album The Reaper. mean, Heart of Darkness was okay. It was a little more. It didn't have as many fast songs on it, but the Reaper definitely did. I mean, the Reaper was kind of like their comeback, like full length comeback album, or Symphony of Death. That EP. And not to use a pun, but again, back to the roots, what they started off doing. And a lot of these songs, I'll tell you what, when you read the lyrics and you listen to them, these songs have some pretty brutal themes to them. A lot of it has to do with serial killers and all sorts of stuff. And I'm going to go back to the interview with Chris again, where he elaborates on this. Check this out. So is there any like actual concept behind the title? Was there a reason you titled the album Bone Collector?
Yeah, there's a really small concept behind that, because we have the Reaper album, we have the Return of the Reaper album, and
Yeah.
don't want to call the new album The Reaper is Out of the Coffin or something like that, you know? So that was the reason why we would be looking for a synonym for the Reaper, and then we found it Bone Collector. That sounds more brutal than the Reaper, and I love that.
Yeah.
No, it's not a concept CD. It's we have some different topics on it. Like Killing is My Pleasure. It's about a guy called Robert Kuglinski. He was a mafia killer in the US. He killed more than 200 people, and he went out to kill from like a 9-to-5 job. And we have The Rich, the Poor, the Dying is some critical stuff about people. A very small percentage in the world has so much money, and 80% of the people don't have any money, and there's a lot of poorness and everything. So, but we have also this typical gravedigger lyrics like Kingdom of Skulls or Bone Collector. I love this Bone Collector chorus because he's a bone collector, grave dictator, death protector, and bone collector. That is more cliche you can't have on an album, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, the first two songs in the album, which you just talked about, those are two of my favorite tracks on the album. I think that what Tobias played on this record, to me, is it just, you never know what you're going to expect when you get a new guitar player. I mean, it's one of those things. When I started listening to the riffs and the actual songs and how heavy they were and how straightforward they were, it was great. It actually reminded me of your old days. It reminded me of the Reaper album a little bit, when, that album came out. And the songs, I'm not saying they sound the same, but obviously the production's a lot better. But yeah, it was more, you didn't do all these big epic intros and things that you've done on these concept albums. You just went straight back to the old days. And then
that was our intention to do that, no? And to make it simple again, because people, at the end, I want to entertain people, and we are not a social criticism band like System of a Down or this guys, We want to entertain like Judas Priest or Saxon, making good songs, faster songs, slower songs, mid-tempo, but always in a simple way, like you expect from a German heavy metal band.
Yeah. The other song probably gets overlooked because it's the last song in the album, Whispers of the Damned.
Yeah, that is a more or less. Yeah, it's not an epic song, but
no,
I think that the lyrics are really, brutal, because it's about the commander of the concentration camp Auschwitz.
Yeah,
that he also, like Robert Kuglinski, the mafia killer, he's working like a 9-to-5 job, sending people to the gas chamber, killing millions of Jews and other people, and then going back home, sitting there with his family, having dinner in the evening. Oh, what you done?
Yeah, like it's nothing. Like he just didn't like nothing happened.
Yeah, and the wife said, "Oh, what you did the whole day at your work? Oh, I put some people in the gas chamber, killed them. Okay, good, nice. So it's weird, and I love this song because the lyrics are so authentic, and I like also the song structure, because I'm a great fan of Ozzy Osbourne and his second solo album, Diary of a Madman, and we take this a little bit as a tribute to this song. You know, when I talked to Toby, hey, let's write a song like this. You know,
Mhm.
and then we came up with this song, and I think, yeah, it's amazing.
That's actually my favorite Ozzy album.
Yeah,
I
mine
just did
too.
I just did an episode on that album. Yeah, it's my favorite Ozzy album, and it's interesting because it was so different from Blizzard of Oz. It really was, But yeah, I noticed a lot of the lyrics. I mean, there's a lot of very dark topics in this album, and what inspired you to write about? There aren't obviously not every one of them. It's not a concept record, but what inspired you to write about a lot of this stuff, especially a lot of this more brutal stuff that's happened, throughout history?
I have a dark soul, my friend. No, I'm such a peaceful guy, but I have this fantasies. Not that I live these fantasies in my normal life, but I can put that to my lyrics. And I'm some kind of storyteller. Like like writing a book or something, but in
Yeah.
a short way. And I love to deal with this kind of topics. So perhaps I'm weird. There's a song on this album also which is a little bit autobiographic. It's Made of Madness.
Mm-hmm.
To do this job, to do this kind of music, you must be made of madness.
Yeah.
And, sometimes I have this part in me who is mad about this kind of lyrics.
Yeah, you've always been in a lot of the lyrics. You've always written about something in history. The kind of the brutal part of the history, like Knights of the Cross. Again about the Crusades, right? You wrote, when you listen to some. I was listening to Heart of Darkness not long ago, and I'm listening to some of these other albums, and really, there's a lot of history that you write about, and more of the brutal side of things. But I've always had that. That's always been what you've done, right? And I'm listening to the lyrics of this album, and I'm like, man, Chris is, I'm thinking to myself, this is about some guy getting killed, but I can't figure out what inspired it until you just told me. But yeah, I mean, it's always been a trademark of yours with that, and I did definitely get a lot of that vibe from the album itself. Graveyard Kings, another great song. I was thinking about that just now. But overall, I think that you did I think this album's much better than the last one. And that's Chris talking about the themes behind a lot of the songs. So again, I'm going to end off this segment here really quick and just say, again, this album's a 10 out of 10. To me, it's one of the top 5 albums they've ever put out. The production I thought sounded very good. He did, Chris did talk about in that interview about why he started taking over the production of the albums. And generally speaking, I like the more straight ahead songwriting. I think it was a great direction for them to go in. With that said, let me know what you think. If you've heard the album or you've heard the singles, what do you think about the newest Gravedigger album, Bone Collector? Let me know in the comments. What do you think of this record? Have you heard it? What do you think? What do you think of the singles? I'm interested to hear from you. Coming up next, after this break, I'm going to talk about why bands should fight harder to get their album promoted properly, especially bands that get signed to record labels and, of course, bands that are a bit new on the scene, as well as the upcoming Udo Dirkschneider album, where he re-records Balls to the Wall, the famous album by Accept, with a group of very impressive musicians. I'll be talking about that right after break, right after this. Hey everybody, Tony here from the Metal Command podcast. Again, I appreciate your support. Since 1998, I have hosted this show in one form or another, starting off in radio and now in the podcast format. Again, thanks for watching, and if you like what you see and hear on this show, by all means, please hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video, and if you see this program on any other form of social media, please give me a follow there. Again, I always appreciate your support. Welcome back to the Metal Command podcast. Tony back here with you, and going to start the second half of the show now. And I'm going to start it off with a segment about why bands need to fight harder to get their albums promoted. And originally, I wanted to talk about how record labels have become part of the bottleneck as to why bands, especially bands that are newer on the scene, I'm not talking about established bands. I am talking about a band that is kind of brand new, that has not been on the scene very long, getting signed to a label, and how labels blatantly mismanaged the promotion of the albums that these bands put out. Now, I went into a previous show. There was a previous show where I talked about how bands screw themselves by their own bad decision making, by, when they first start out, by thinking they are too good to go on all these podcasts, thinking they're going to get on some show that's got millions of followers. I went into that, and I talked about why that's a very bad thing and why they are shooting themselves in the foot. However, there are bands that do not have that attitude. Most smaller bands out there do not have that attitude, at least the ones that I've encountered. Right? But the thing is, record labels and the staff they have working for them are one of the biggest reasons why a lot of these bands do not really see the needle move when they get signed. I mean, it might move a little bit. Hey, you're on Metal Blade, you're on Nuclear Blast, you're on AFM, whatever. But there's so many times now where I see a new band on the scene and I watch the promotion of their album, and that promotion is piss poor. So I was originally going to do a segment on why bands are, why the promotion is piss poor, why newer bands are having a much harder time making it on the scene. And there's numerous reasons for it. One of the reasons I was going to talk about are what record labels are doing wrong. And then I saw this podcast, the Heavy Business podcast with Justin Roth and Curtis Dewar. Curtis, of course, a publicist that does a lot of really great work. Justin, of course, has a band called War Curse. And they were talking about band failures, like how to deal with failure and where you went wrong. And Justin was talking about where he felt he had gone wrong and how he dealt with it when it comes to his own band, War Curse. Now, War Curse is a band that is a newer band on the scene. I think they have 3 albums out. I've never heard the first one. But there was the newest album is called Confession, and then he had one called Eradication. Both pretty good releases, in my opinion. Both are different albums. Eradication is more thrash metal. There's a song called The Serpent on there. If you've never heard that song, I think it's one of the best songs on the album. And then, of course, Confession, which was a little bit different as far as the songwriting was concerned. But Justin went on this podcast. It's about an hour long. I'll put a link to the show notes to the podcast. It's the entire podcast itself. But they were talking about something that is basically related to what this segment was originally going to be about. And it's talking about why bands should fight harder to get their album promoted properly, why they need to have the right people promoting their album, and he gives one of the reasons I think record labels drop the ball so often. I want you to listen to this interview segment from the Heavy Business podcast where Justin talks about the promotion for their album Confession. And then I'm going to come and elaborate and give you my thoughts on it. Check this interview segment out because it's a great summary of one of the things he felt he went wrong and where they could have probably fought harder to really make that album Confession that they had put out more successful. Check it out.
But as far as the album goes, like, it wasn't received super well. I think some of our legacy fans really loved it, and some of them really hated it. Like, I kind of knew going into it that was going to be the case because we did make some changes. We made we made some changes in like vocal direction. We made some changes in like, songwriting approach. The songs were a little shorter. There
Yeah.
was a little more singing, which, for metal fans, I think sometimes can be a bit jarring, if you're just expecting somebody to yell at you for 45 minutes and
But you
all.
consciously decided to do all that, and like, if I recall correctly, like you wanted to do that.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I knew it was going to be received weird, but like
Yeah.
I thought it would be received better than it was.
Fair.
And I think that and just so I just feel like we got to put everything on the table here. If I'm going to be honest, I need to be all the way honest. This was also the first album where you didn't do our PR, and
Yeah.
like that, and that was hard for me, and it sucked really bad because like when you have a publicist for a long time, and you've been my publicist now for 11 years, it's like
Yeah.
you have a good working relationship. They understand you, they understand your band, they care. I mean, like
Yeah.
you've been very invested in the project all along, and now like I'm giving somebody by the record label who doesn't know me from Adam and doesn't give a shit about I mean, if we're being honest, like I know
Yeah.
that sounds harsh. I'm sure the person, maybe they cared a little bit, but like they didn't care to the level of somebody you've been working with for over a decade. So
Of course, and that's just not going to happen.
yeah, so I mean, like, we got some decent playlist placement, but a lot of those I had to pitch myself thanks to contacts I got from you and Corey.
Yeah.
And a lot of the press releases that went out were just kind of like setting us up to fail. And like there was comparisons made to like Metallica's Black Album and shit like that, which
I don't
if
remember that. Wow.
yeah, that was in the press release. It's like way to set the bar impossibly fucking high. Like, let's just present this project as like the single, the Black Album is the #1 selling fucking metal album of like, all time. Like, yeah, let's just go ahead and set the bar that high. Make sure I trip
Yeah.
right over it. So yeah, I mean, like shit like that was really tough. And it's just the album, the singles that got picked were weird, and like I didn't pick them. I picked the first one, which went over well, and then the next two are songs that like I honestly fucking regret writing. So it's like it's just one of them things, man. You live and you learn. Like I didn't know how much I could push back. It's like you just signed to a big label. You're dealing with a bunch of people who have dealt with your favorite bands for years. It's like it's really easy to become passive at that point in time and just become a passenger on the ride and just say like, all right, guys, I trust you, do whatever you want to do. But in hindsight, I don't necessarily think that's the right approach. I think like when it's your project and you know it better than anybody, I think like you should really be the one fighting for it. And I think you should really be the one taking the wheel and making decisions. And, even if it seems like you're being pushy or what, it's your vision. You're the one that's got to live with it for the rest of your life. I have some sincere regret for not pushing back harder, especially on the singles, especially the third single, The Focus Track, was just a really bad song.
What was the third single again?
It was Sowing Division.
Oh, that's right. Convoy was second, and then what was the first one? I forgot.
Miracle Broker was first. And
That's
that one,
right.
and that one went over really good. So like I feel like I was at least kind of vindicated there. And it's not to blame the label. Like I wrote the fucking songs. I'm not sitting here trying to like pass the buck. I think that's one thing that people immediately do when they fail is just like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna blame everybody else. Like, no, like this is me right now. Like I'm telling you, I fucked up. Like I wrote the album. I own it, I wouldn't have picked those.
Okay, so there's a lot to take from that interview segment from their podcast. And notice one of the first things that Justin talks about in that interview segment. He talks about the fact that this was the first album Curtis, who has done their publicity most of the time. He talked about how Curtis did not do the promotion for that album and talked about how it was the first time that this happened. And I'm going to go back to that here in a minute. Let me start it off by saying this. And this, first of all, this is something that doesn't just happen with a band like Workhorse. It happens to a lot of bands. But I'm going to use Workhorse as an example as to what happens to a lot of bands that get signed to a record label for the first time. And when I say get signed, I'm talking about to a little bit of a bigger metal label like Metal Blade or Nuclear Blast or any of these labels out there that are signing bands. I thought the album Confession that they had put out, he talked about having mixed reviews. I thought the album was very good. The album I thought was very, very good. And I felt that the promotion, well, I'm just going to say it flat out. The promotion of that album was piss poor. In fact, if you want to set the gold standard of what not to do to promote an album, all you got to do is look at how that Workhorse album was actually promoted, or the lack of promotion. And the fact that, in my opinion, they went wrong in pretty much every aspect of the marketing of that record. So I'm going to say this. I'm going to talk about the first thing he spoke about. Aside from the publicist thing, I'm going to go into the singles. The singles are very important. Folks, I've been doing this over a quarter of a century, and I'm pretty good at thinking and knowing what singles would best represent an album. Because if you were a new band or newer band and you're looking to promote an album, the first impression people get from your record, from your band, are the videos, the lyric videos, the singles that you put up on YouTube or any other streaming format. That is the first impression people get. And honestly, that can make or break your record. Because if you give people a bad first impression, they are less likely to stream it and they are less likely to buy it. So he brought up the singles in this interview segment and how he wasn't happy with 2 out of the 3 singles. And I completely agree. In fact, I told him this when this album was basically put out. So they put 3 singles out on the album. Now, Confession was a much different record than Eradication, because Eradication was basically straight ahead, balls out thrash metal. Confession was not. They progressed a lot in the songwriting. A lot of the songs were different. They still had some thrash elements in it, but the songwriting evolved, and it was different than Eradication. But I'm going to tell you, they dropped the ball on the promotion for this album, and I'm going to go into the first aspect of that. So let's talk about the singles. They had a song called Miracle Broker, which did pretty well for them. They put out a song called Sowing Division. That was one of the singles, and they had a song called The Convoy, which was one of the singles. And I'll be honest with you, 2 out of those 3 songs should not have been the single for the album. I think those are the 3 songs they put out. Let me start off with the first one. Let me start off by talking about the 2 songs I thought should not have been singles. That would be Miracle Broker, and that would be the song Sowing Division. Those are actually my 2 least favorite songs on the album. Sowing Division, in my opinion, is the worst song on the album. And to be honest, and this is kind of brutal, and maybe Justin might disagree with me, but I pretty much skip that song if I listen to the album Confession. And it's not so much because it's not my favorite song. It's about how the songs are written, and you want to pick the songs that best represent what this album is all about. So me being somebody that's complaining about this, I'm going to give you my solution to what I would have done if I were the one in charge of marketing this record, which again, the publicity and the marketing for this album was piss poor. And piss poor from the standpoint that there's a lack of vision, and in my opinion, there was a lot of laziness when it came to promoting this album. And I'm not talking about from the band themselves. I'm talking about from the label and whoever was doing the publicity for it. So there's 2 songs I would have put out as singles, and this is how I would have marketed them. The first song is called Power of the Powerless. It's actually my favorite song on the record. But the reason that I'm picking it isn't because it's my favorite song on the record. It's the way it's written, and it's the theme behind the song. The way it's written and constructed is great. I mean, if you're looking for a track on an album like this to really appeal to a lot of metalheads, and if you're looking for a song that really represents the album well, it's this one. It's the way it's written. It's the way it's constructed. The solos are in the perfect place in the song. I mean, if you're looking to reel listeners in, you want to listen to that song. You want to put that song out there. And then on top of that, it had a great theme behind it. And the theme was about Marv Heemeyer, the guy that built the Killdozer. Now, if you don't know what the Killdozer is, it's a guy that basically got screwed over by the local government in Colorado in a small town. He took a construction bulldozer and made it into a tank and pretty much started flattening buildings of all the people that screwed him over, essentially. First of all, that's one of the most heavy metal themes you could possibly have for a song. But there are people that still talk about the Killdozer. There's people that kind of have an admiration for the fact the guy pretty much went psycho and started flattening, buildings in that town of all the people that screwed him over. And what they could have done is put that song out, which is really well written, sounds great. It's almost a perfect heavy metal song, in my opinion, with the way it's written. And then what you could have done in the lyric video, you could have put footage of the Killdozer. You could have taken excerpts from some of those tapes where Marv Heemeyer was talking about why he's doing what he's doing. And you could have put that in there, and that would have drawn a lot of attention to that song. And most of the people that I know that listen to the album, that's one of their top 2 or 3 favorite songs on the album. It's because of the theme and the way it's written. That's the first, and everybody knows a lot of people know about the Killdozer. And if you don't, there's a documentary called Tread. But a lot of people know about the Killdozer. You could have easily marketed that song in that manner. And I guarantee you, it would have drawn more attention than a song, say, Sowing Division, which is kind of a very boring track, in my opinion. The next song, and it's not my favorite song on the album, nor is it my second favorite, but it is a song that I think would have been great for a single, and you could have easily used marketed the lyrical theme of this track, and that is a song called Fortress of Agony. If you've ever listened to the album Confession, I'm going to put a link to it, by the way. Fortress of Agony is about human trafficking. Now, human trafficking is something that a lot of people are obviously against. It is something that universally, people that know about what's going on at like the border of the country, down south, a lot of people that subject resonates with a ton of people, with almost everybody. Not to mention the song, again, the way it's written would be a perfect song as a single to help represent what this album is about. And you could have easily put that song out, put a lyric video out. You could have put human trafficking statistics in that video. You could have shown footage of people being rescued. You could have done a lot of things with that song to really draw attention to it. Those 2 singles alone are a great representation of the album. And then the third single, which I did agree with them putting out, was a song called The Convoy. I think that song is very good. But the reason I am all for that song being one of their singles is because it best represents the progression and the different kind of songwriting they did on the album. So you got songs that are more up-tempo, and, they have this great vibe that really represent what the album sounds like. And then you have another song that represents the different songwriting approach they took to some of the songs on the album. That's how I would have marketed this thing. Instead, what they did is they picked 3 songs. One which bores the crap out of me and most people that actually hear the track itself, Sowing Division. Miracle Broker, it did well for them, but I think the other 2 singles that I'm thinking of would have done a lot better. And again, I'm speaking as somebody that has dealt with publicists and labels sending me singles and sending me albums for almost 27 years now. Those 2 songs would have definitely moved the needle in a more positive direction for this band. Now, there's a really great track. Actually, my second favorite song would be a song called Illusion of Choice. That's the last song in the album. But You got to go with what resonates the most with people if you're going to market something. That is why I would say pick Fortress of Agony over the last song on the album, which I think is excellent. I think the title track is excellent. But you got to pick songs that people are going to be drawn to. It has to be constructed right. It has to be written correctly. The song has to sound like it represents the rest of the album really well. And you have to have a great theme with the lyrics. And if you have all of that, then you are going in the right direction from a marketing standpoint. The second thing is, and where the big screw up is, and I see this with almost every new band that comes out, was their press release. Now, he talked about the press release alluding to the Black Album by Metallica. First of all, that is a very big mistake a lot of bands make. I get why a lot of publicists and I get why labels do this, where they try to compare it to something because they think, oh my God, the Black Album sold 20 million copies or however much it's sold. If people think it's going to sound like that, they're going to be drawn to it. And the answer to that is no, that's not what's going to happen. What a lot of people think, and this has been something that a lot of listeners and a lot of people have said to me over the years, is they see that and they're like, oh, it's going to be a clone. Why would I want to listen to something that sounds like the Black Album when I can just go listen to the Black Album? And a lot of people think like that. It's unfair, but that is the case. And not only that, but when people make those comparisons, first of all, Confession sounds nothing like the Black Album. Or you'll get a lot of these power metal bands where they'll say it sounds like, Halloween's Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 1 and 2. Or you'll get you just get a lot of that. And publicists, because see, when someone says something like that, oh, it sounds like Halloween Keeper 1 or 2, people are going to think it's a generic power metal clone and they're not even going to check it out. Especially with how saturated the music business itself actually is. So that press release was terrible. And what they should have done is describe the style of music they are playing without comparing it to another album or another band. Because when you compare it to too many bands, people think it's going to be a clone of those bands and not even listen to it. When someone sends me a press release without listening to the music and they compare it to something, I look at it and be like, I guarantee it doesn't sound like that record. And then on top of that, you are setting an unrealistic expectation for someone to think, hey, I'm going to listen to something that's a lot like the Black Album, but it doesn't sound like it. I do not think Workhorse's Confession album sounds like the Black Album, not in the slightest. I mean, there's a Metallica influence. They've influenced a lot of people, so you hear a little bit of that in the guitar playing maybe in some of the rhythms, but for the most part, the singing is different, the songwriting is different, everything about the album is different. And those kinds of press releases are absolutely horrendous. And it's very poor judgment. It's a very easy way for people to try to describe a band. Instead of going through what they sound like, instead of comparing them to their original album, like what I would have done is say, hey, they had a thrash metal album called Eradication. Their songwriting has progressed. There's a little more melody in the songwriting, a little bit more singing in there. That's what I would have done. Because comparing a new band to the people that came before them is bad. And to be honest, it gives people the wrong impression right from the get-go. And unfortunately, that's what happens to a lot of bands, not just Workhorse, but it happens to a lot of bands out there. I'll get these albums. There was a band called Lotharo from Canada. And I can't remember who it was, but I don't believe that press release really sounded like that. It made me want to listen to them. And I did. And I absolutely love that band's, first record. I mean, they had another album before that, but their first album on a actual record label, Rainy Phoenix Music. But generally speaking, the way the Workhorse thing was handled was piss poor. They picked the wrong singles. They didn't really market the album the way they should have. And the lesson in the press release was terrible. The lesson to be learned is that just what Justin said in acknowledging a failure. I get that record labels can be intimidating and they can say that, oh yeah, you know, we know what we're doing. No, you don't. 20 years ago, a lot of these labels knew what they were doing. A lot of them do not. In fact, 20 years ago, they usually picked the right single. Now, very rarely do they really hit the mark on one single, let alone all three or even four. Not saying everybody is like this, but they are wrong more often than they are right. Now, I'm going to play one more interview segment from that podcast because it goes into what this segment was originally going to be about. And it was going to be about how record labels mismanage and mishandle new bands that they sign. Check this interview segment out really quick because Justin talks about one of the reasons I was going to give as to why this is. Check it out.
There's a lot of metal. There's a lot of metal being released, and there's a lot of subgenres, and everybody's very like subgenre specific and very snobby about like I only like this exact certain weird, you know. So it's like you got to identify your target audience, and you got to try to get on tours with bands that are relevant enough to put you in front of people you want to play for, but like different enough that the tour is fun and interesting. You know, it's like all these. It's a tightrope walk. You know, it's like doing this. It's like you're always overcoming the next hurdle. Everything's an obstacle. Everything's very unclear. It's a muddied, weird industry to navigate. There's no other industry like this.
Yeah, and the worst part is that most of the people that you work with or that you need to work with have no clue what they're doing.
Sadly, yes.
Yep.
And I mean, I hate to be that way, but it does seem that way.
Yep.
I have often joked that you could restaff. I think a lot of people know, well, maybe not listening to this, but like, you know, I do design work for a lot of bigger bands.
Yeah,
I've done tour management work and guitar tech work and, you know, logistical work. You know, I've worked a lot behind the scenes for a lot of like really big name bands that you've heard of. And I've seen behind those curtains as well. And like, it blows my mind. I feel like I could restaff a lot of record labels and a lot of PR houses and a lot of these. I could restaff these places with the crew of my local Wendy's and like no one would know the fucking difference. Like, and I know that's like an asshole thing to say. Look, I don't care. Like, I'm here to tell the truth today. But it's for real, man. Like, I come from corporate America. Like, you know, I had fucking like I was accountable for things, you know?
Yeah.
There was accountability. It's like if you fucking sucked at your job, somebody noticed. But it's like when you're the only people you have to answer to are fucking, you know, metal musicians who, you know, half of them don't know enough to be dangerous and the other half don't care enough to fucking call you on your shit. It's like they've gotten so used to getting away with shit, and a lot of these people get their jobs through nepotism or just they dated somebody that was in a band that was on the label, or you know, they were in the right place at the right time when the guy next to them got fired and they got promoted. It's like, I don't know. There's a lot of people that end up in this industry that, you know, by hook or crook, like maybe they're not the most qualified people. But again, that's another thing you got to identify and you got to deal with, you know? So it's like, if your publicist isn't doing their job, like you got to pick up the slack. You got to either 1, hire another publicist, 2, do some fucking legwork yourself. You know, there's nothing saying you can't email media outlets or you can't, you know, pitch for playlists or you can't fucking 100%. Figure things out on your own, you know? Really, you should just hire a good publicist and then you don't have to do all that shit. But you know, when things, again, like this industry is all about knowing how to pivot. You know, you have shit thrown at you and things fall through and things go wrong. It's like, that's just what it is. Like, it's the nature of this. Even in the biggest bands in the world, they cancel tours and they have problems and shit. So it's like, if you're not prepared to overcome adversity, like this definitely ain't the industry for you to be in.
Okay. So notice what he talked about there. He talked about hiring the right publicist, and I'll get into that here in a second. And then he said you could replace most people at these publicity companies and the staff at most record labels with the staff of your local Wendy's. You would never know the difference. Now, when I heard that, I started laughing. Now, my line was going to be, you could replace most of them with cardboard cutouts and you wouldn't know the difference. But what he is talking about is a huge problem. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, because I go back that far, a lot of these labels had very knowledgeable people. They had people that were very good at their job. They had people that did a phenomenal job at marketing bands and picking the right singles and picking the right publicist for that specific band or for the bands on that label in general. Now they missed the mark. And he is dead right when I tell you. Now, this isn't every record label. There's a couple record labels that do a great job with their bands. Now, someone may come back to me and say, well, oh, they're putting all this money into this band or that band. Yeah. If you look at the most of the bands that are doing well in those labels, they are bands that are established already. They are a band that essentially has been around for 25 years, 20 years, 30 years, 35 years, 40 years. Those bands basically sell themselves. All you got to do is get the record out there, invest a bunch of money in promoting them as far as like, you know, sponsored ads and putting up lyric videos, stuff like that. So it's easy to promote an established legacy band on your label. And some of those established legacy bands have only been around 20 to 25 years, and they are doing well. And why are they doing well? Or at least doing somewhat well? Because they were promoted properly back in the day. Now, new bands, and for those of you that say there are no good new bands, that's a pile of crap, because I do hear them. A lot of new bands do not get promoted properly. I just talked about why a few minutes ago. And again, they're picking, it's basically like he just said, they dated somebody, there's nepotism involved, they know somebody. It's not about the most qualified person, it's who you know. Because it's one thing to be able to successfully promote a band that's been around over 20 years. It's a completely different thing if you can move the needle for a new artist that you sign to your label. And record labels, hate to say this, they are a big part of why the ball is being dropped on these new bands. Now, as I said in a previous show, there are times when those bands are at fault themselves for refusing to do interviews on certain shows because, it doesn't have a big enough following or some other petty reason. And, you know, it's funny because usually it's a band that has like 1,000 followers and they think that magically that following is going to grow and that magically some outlet like Loudwire is going to want them to come on the show. But those entities don't care about a band with 3,000 following, with 3,000 followers or 4,000 or whatever the case may be. And when you refuse to go on podcasts to try and grow that following, that's on the band. But I'm not talking about that right now. What I'm talking about is how record labels drop the ball. And they do. A lot of them do. Not all of them. There are some that are still very, very good at what they do. But more often than not, they do a piss poor job at promoting a lot of the newer bands they bring on to the scene. They bring on to the label. They bring on to the roster. They just do a piss poor job. Because they don't go through the grind the way they should to promote these bands. They think it's going to yield the same results they would get from an established legacy band that's on that label. And it doesn't work like that. Those bands have already earned their reputation. They already have their fan base. And they're going to be a success in 95% of the time. It's when you get the new bands that you're trying to build an audience for. That is where the ball gets dropped. Lastly, before I end this, what should have happened for workers is a label should not have forced a band to take on a publicist or shouldn't tell them, hey, you have to use this person. Though the best thing for a band to do is to use a publicist that knows them and has worked with them extensively. Because there's a reason that band ended up getting noticed by the label, right? If they've been working with the same publicist for 10 years, The label finally takes notice of what they are doing and signs them. How do you think they got there? They ended up getting there because that publicist also had a hand in it. And again, folks, this is why bands should fight. It's their vision. They should push back and fight for what they think should be the singles on their album. They should push back as far as who is going to promote them. It shouldn't be somebody that's just assigned to them that doesn't give a shit about that band or doesn't know them. It should be a publicist they know and that they trust. Because if you listen to that segment, he talked about having to go outside of that publicist or that label to go get interviews. In fact, I had to go to him. I went to him and said, "Hey, why don't you come on my show?" Sadly, I have to do that a lot. Or a band will be like, why am I not on your show? I don't understand. I don't get it. Well, because your publicist or record label did not get back to me. Now, this podcast does not have the biggest following. I will acknowledge that. But when I see interviews from some of these bands on a podcast with 20 followers, or it has like 10 views, I don't really have much else to say aside from that. So that's the lesson to be learned. If you are in a new band getting signed to a new label, getting signed to a record label for the first time, keep that stuff in mind. Do not let them try to push you into something, because I can tell you, and anybody with half a brain could tell you, with Warcurse and a lot of these other bands, there are so many other songs that should be used as singles than the ones these labels want to promote. Back in the day, they were very knowledgeable. They knew what they were doing. They had people that were very qualified and had a track record. But now it's like the blind leading the blind. The marketing is absolutely terrible. With that said, let's get to the last segment of this show. Going to talk about Udo Dirkschneider. Udo Dirkschneider has a re-recorded version of the Accept album Balls to the Wall that he is going to release. And I have some thoughts on that. So I think this is a really cool idea. Normally, when a band says, "Hey, we're going to re-record this album," I kind of take it with a grain of salt. I'm really not like enthused or excited about it, because most of the time that re-recording doesn't do the band's original album justice. Sometimes it does. Sometimes, like the Blind Guardian re-recording of Somewhere Far Beyond, I thought sounded great. But more often than not, I'm kind of like, when bands are like, we're gonna re-record a classic album, an album that was very big for us, I kind of just like, okay, whatever. Doesn't really do anything for me, right? I think this is cool. And the reason that I think this is cool is the fact that Udo was doing this in a much different way than most other bands do re-recordings. You know, on occasion, these re-recorded albums, they do have guests that do come on, maybe play a solo. But on this record, he has a different singer on the album with him on each song of this album. I'm going to read off. Let's look at the list of people that he has on this album, because he has a very, very impressive list of people and a very diverse list of people. I want to give you my thoughts on each one of these singers when it comes to this Accept album. Let's flash this up here on the screen really quick of the list of singers he has singing on this album with him. Check this out. So, the title track, Balls to the Wall, Joachim Broden of Sabaton. That's an excellent choice. London Leather Boys. You got Biff Bifford from Saxon. You can't go wrong there. Fight It Back. He has Mil Petroza from Creator singing on that. I think that's really cool. That'll be interesting. Head Over Heels, you have Nils Mullen of Dynasty. Very good vocalist. I think he'd sound great. Now, this is one that I think was very, very interesting. On the song Losing More Than You've Ever Had, Michael Kiske from Helloween, who is a completely different style of singer than pretty much anybody on this record. and of course, so much different than Udo. Eva Erickson from Brothers of Metal singing the song Love Child. Turn Me On with Danko Jones. Losers and Winners with Dee Snider. I think that sounds really interesting. Guardians of the Night, Tim Ripper Owens. Can't really go wrong with Tim singing on a song like that. And then last but not least, one of my favorite people in the metal scene that I've ever interviewed, Doro Pesch, singing on the song Winter Dreams. I don't know about you, but this re-recording of this album has me kind of excited because he's doing this in a manner that's a lot different than a lot of other bands would probably do this. First of all, you have a list of great singers. There's not one singer on this list that I think would sound bad on any of these songs. The Michael Kiske thing is very intriguing, but you have a list of great talent on this re-recording of this album. I mean, I'm looking at this list and I'm like, you know, you can't go wrong with any of these people. Now, the Doro Pesch and Michael Kiske renditions of the songs that they are singing on are the ones I'm very interested in. But man, you got Tim Ripper Owens singing on it, Mil Petroza. You just have a lot of great singers on this re-recording. And I think it's a great way to celebrate an album because I can guarantee you, I don't know how much of an influence Accept has had on all these people, but it's probably had some influence on them, especially the German musicians. Like, you know, Accept, you know, again, Scorpions and Accept were like the two bands from Germany, or two of the bands from Germany that really had a huge impact on the metal scene there. The Scorpions, especially early on, like during the Uli Roth days, and then of course Accept coming a little bit later, and Wolf Hoffman being who he is. Wolf Hoffman's a fantastic guitar player, fantastic songwriter, and Accept has just been a big influence for a lot of musicians. So I love the fact Udo is doing this. Now, if he was just going and re-recording the album and just singing on it, to me, it would be pretty boring. But the fact he is doing it with a lot of these guests is what I find not only fascinating, but it's a twist that you don't see many times when it comes to re-recordings of classic albums. I'm looking forward to checking this out. I'm actually looking forward to hearing this record and hearing what these singers sound like on these songs. Want to know what you think. What do you think of this re-recording? Even if you're not a fan of bands re-recording albums, I'm curious as to what you all think. Thank you for watching and listening to the Metal Command podcast. If you like what you see and hear on this show, by all means, subscribe to the channel. Hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video. And of course, if you are following me on any other form of social media, by all means, give me a like and a follow there. Thanks for watching. Stay metal.